Imagine an entire army division. Tanks, artillery, trucks, command posts, and thousands of soldiers, materializing overnight in the French countryside. German reconnaissance planes fly overhead, photographing the massive buildup. Radio operators frantically intercept American communications discussing battle plans. Intelligence officers mark their maps with growing alarm. A major Allied offensive is clearly imminent. But here's the twist that would change warfare forever. None of it was real. The tanks were rubber balloons. The artillery pieces were painted canvas stretched over wooden frames. The radio chatter was scripted theater. And the soldiers manning this phantom army? They were artists, sound engineers, actors, and designers. Creative minds armed not with rifles, but with imagination. This is the true story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army, the most extraordinary con artists ever to wear an American uniform. Chapter 1. A desperate idea born in darkness. The year was 1943, and the Allied forces faced a brutal mathematical problem. To defeat Nazi Germany, they needed to invade Fortress Europe. But German forces were entrenched across France, with cracked divisions, extensive fortifications, and years of preparation. Every military strategist knew the invasion would be a bloodbath, unless they could find a way to be in two places at once. In a nondescript office in London, a British officer named Colonel Dudley Clark had been experimenting with an audacious concept. What if you could create entire fake armies to confuse the enemy? Not just feed them false intelligence through spies, but actually stage elaborate physical deceptions that would fool aerial reconnaissance, ground observers, and radio intelligence all at once. The idea seemed insane. Armies are massive, complex organizations. How could you possibly fake one convincingly enough to fool the Wehrmacht's experienced intelligence apparatus? The answer came from an unlikely source: the film industry. American military planners realized that Hollywood had been creating convincing illusions for decades. Set designers could make a soundstage look like ancient Rome. Special effects artists could create explosions and battle scenes that fooled audiences worldwide. Why couldn't these same techniques be applied to warfare? And so, in the spring of 1944, a secret unit began to take shape. The U.S. Army put out a quiet call for a very specific type of soldier: artists, designers, actors, sound engineers, and creative professionals. Men who could paint, sculpt, build sets, and think like Hollywood producers rather than infantry officers. The answer came from an unlikely source: the film industry. American military planners realized that Hollywood had been creating convincing illusions for decades. Set designers could make a soundstage look like ancient Rome. Special effects artists could create explosions and battle scenes that fooled audiences worldwide. Why couldn't these same techniques be applied to warfare? And so, in the spring of 1944, a secret unit began to take shape. The U.S. Army put out a quiet call for a very specific type of soldier: artists, designers, actors, sound engineers, and creative professionals. Men who could paint, sculpt, build sets, and think like Hollywood producers rather than infantry officers. The recruitment process for the Ghost Army was unlike anything in military history. While most units looked for the strongest, toughest, most physically capable men, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops wanted something entirely different: imagination. Bill Blass, who would later become one of America's most famous fashion designers, found himself trading sketches for camouflage patterns. Ellsworth Kelly, destined to become a renowned abstract artist, used his eye for color and form to help design deceptive installations. Art Kane, who would revolutionize fashion photography, learned how to make inflatable rubber tanks look real through careful positioning and shadow work. These weren't your typical GIs. Many came from top art schools: Pratt Institute, Cooper Union, the Art Students League of New York. Some were commercial artists from advertising agencies on Madison Avenue. Others were theater set designers from Broadway, special effects technicians from Hollywood studios, or professional sound engineers from radio networks. At their training base in Camp Forest, Tennessee, this motley crew of creative minds began an education in deception that would have seemed absurd if it weren't deadly serious. They learned how to inflate 60-foot-long rubber tanks using portable air compressors. These inflatable decoys, designed by engineers at a rubber company, weighed just 90 pounds. light enough for 4 men to carry what appeared to be a 30-ton Sherman tank. But making them look real from the air was an art form. The Ghost Army soldiers learned to position them to create realistic shadows, to add fake track marks in the mud, to drape camouflage netting in ways that suggested hurried concealment rather than careful staging. They practiced with inflatable artillery pieces, fake supply dumps, and dummy landing craft. They learned the radio procedures and call signs of real combat units, so they could impersonate them over the airwaves. They studied the habits and patterns of actual divisions, learning how a real armored unit moved, communicated, and behaved. Most bizarrely, they trained with specialized sound equipment that could project the noise of a massive military operation across miles. Engineers had recorded actual tank columns, truck convoys, bridge-building operations, and troop movements onto records and magnetic wire. These recordings could then be played back through powerful speakers mounted on half-tracks, creating the audio signature of a division on the move, even when nothing was there. The most challenging training was psychological. These men would be operating behind the lines, often alone or in small groups, creating elaborate stage sets while real combat raged nearby. They had to perfect their deceptions, knowing that if the Germans saw through the illusion, they wouldn't just lose the tactical advantage, they'd likely get killed. By spring 1944, the Ghost Army was ready. They had no idea they were about to participate in the greatest military invasion in human history. Chapter 3: D-Day's Shadow Players. As hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers prepared to storm the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Ghost Army was staging a different kind of invasion, one designed to never happen. Operation Quicksilver was the deception component of D-Day, and it was staggeringly ambitious. The goal was to convince the Germans that the main Allied invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, rather than Normandy. To sell this lie, the Allies created an entirely fictitious army group, the 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, supposedly commanded by General George Patton and massing in southeast England. The Ghost Army soldiers worked alongside British deception units to bring FUSAG to life. In fields across Kent and Sussex, they erected vast camps of inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, and fake supply depots. They created entire airfields populated with plywood aircraft. They generated constant radio traffic discussing training exercises, equipment requisitions, and deployment orders for units that existed only in German intelligence files. The deception had to be perfect because German reconnaissance planes flew regular missions over England, photographing every visible military installation. Luftwaffe analysts would study these photos with meticulous care, counting vehicles, identifying unit insignia, and tracking troop movements. One mistake, one deflated tank caught on camera, one obviously fake piece of equipment, could unravel the entire operation. The Ghost Army soldiers approached their work with the precision of theater producers staging opening night. They didn't just place fake tanks randomly in fields. They arranged them exactly as real armored units would, with proper spacing, defensive positioning, and tactical logic. They created fake tire tracks leading to and from the dummy vehicles. They hung laundry near tents. They even had soldiers walk regular patrols through the fake camps, ensuring that aerial photos would show human activity. The radio deception was equally elaborate. Ghost Army operators transmitted thousands of messages using the call signs and communication patterns of real divisions. They requested supplies that actual units would need. They reported equipment problems, requested medical evacuations for fictional casualties, and complained about delays. All the mundane chatter that fills military radio nets. The deception worked brilliantly. When D-Day came, Hitler and his generals remained convinced for weeks that Normandy was a feint and that the real invasion would still hit Pas-de-Calais. They held crack divisions in reserve hundreds of miles from the actual fighting, waiting for FUSAG's Phantom Army to materialize. Those divisions never reached Normandy, and their absence likely saved thousands of Allied lives. But for the Ghost Army, D-Day was just the beginning. Their most dangerous and creative work still lay ahead. After the Normandy invasion, the Ghost Army crossed to France and entered a new, more dangerous phase of operations. No longer staging deceptions from the safety of England, they would now operate in active combat zones, often within miles or even hundreds of yards of German positions. Their first major operation in France was near Brest in September 1944. The objective was to make the Germans believe that two full divisions were preparing to attack the heavily fortified port city from the south, while the actual assault came from different directions. The Ghost Army soldiers arrived under cover of darkness, their convoy of trucks carrying inflatable tanks, dummy artillery, and sound equipment. They had to set up their elaborate deception within German artillery range, knowing that if discovered, they'd be sitting ducks. Working through the night, they inflated dozens of rubber tanks and positioned them in assembly areas. They strung camouflage netting. They created fake command posts with radio antennas. And as dawn approached, they activated their secret weapon, the Sonic Deception Unit. Mounted on half-tracks hidden in woods near German lines, massive speakers began projecting recorded sounds across the battlefield. The thunderous rumble of tank engines starting up, the metallic clank of treads, the shouted orders of tank commanders, the grinding of gears as an armored column supposedly maneuvered into attack position. To German observers listening from their fortifications, it sounded exactly like a major armored force preparing for assault. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed visual evidence of tanks and artillery in exactly those positions. German commanders shifted their reserves to meet this threat, weakening their defenses elsewhere. The actual Allied attack came from a completely different direction and succeeded in taking objectives that might otherwise have been impregnable. The Ghost Army had scored its first tactical victory on European soil, but they'd also learned a terrifying lesson. This work was far more dangerous than they'd imagined. What made the Ghost Army unique wasn't just their mission, it was who they were. These weren't professional soldiers who happened to have artistic skills. They were artists and designers who'd been handed rifles and told to use their creativity as a weapon. And they remained artists throughout the war, documenting their experiences in ways that offered a unique perspective on combat. Many Ghost Army soldiers carried sketchbooks alongside their standard military gear. During downtime between operations, they'd fan out through French and German villages, drawing the devastation of war with an artist's eye for detail and composition. Their sketches captured not just the physical destruction, the bombed churches, the shattered homes, the rubble-strewn streets, but also the human dimension. Exhausted civilians, displaced families, the strange juxtaposition of ancient European culture and modern mechanized warfare. Some paintings and drawings from Ghost Army artists would later hang in major museums, offering a distinctive view of World War II. Unlike official military photographers or combat artists, these men saw the war through a lens of deception and illusion, which gave their work an almost surreal quality. Bill Blass sketched fashion designs between operations, imagining the clothes he'd create when the war ended. Ellsworth Kelly experimented with abstraction, his later artistic breakthroughs influenced by the patterns of camouflage and deception he worked with daily. Arthur Shilstone painted portraits of his fellow soldiers that captured the strange combination of creativity and danger that defined their experience. The Ghost Army had scored its first tactical victory on European soil, but they'd also learned a terrifying lesson. This work was far more dangerous than they'd imagined. What made the Ghost Army unique wasn't just their mission, it was who they were. These weren't professional soldiers who happened to have artistic skills. They were artists and designers who'd been handed rifles and told to use their creativity as a weapon. And they remained artists throughout the war, documenting their experiences in ways that offered a unique perspective on combat. Many Ghost Army soldiers carried sketchbooks alongside their standard military gear. During downtime between operations, they'd fan out through French and German villages, drawing the devastation of war with an artist's eye for detail and composition. Their sketches captured not just the physical destruction, the bombed churches, the shattered homes, the rubble-strewn streets, but also the human dimension. Exhausted civilians, displaced families, the strange juxtaposition of ancient European culture and modern mechanized warfare. Some paintings and drawings from Ghost Army artists would later hang in major museums, offering a distinctive view of World War II. Unlike official military photographers or combat artists, these men saw the war through a lens of deception and illusion, which gave their work an almost surreal quality. Bill Blass sketched fashion designs between operations, imagining the clothes he'd create when the war ended. Ellsworth Kelly experimented with abstraction, his later artistic breakthroughs influenced by the patterns of camouflage and deception he worked with daily. Arthur Shilstone painted portraits of his fellow soldiers that captured the strange combination of creativity and danger that defined their experience. They also maintained an unofficial unit newsletter filled with cartoons, jokes, and satirical commentary on their bizarre military service. The humor was often dark. What else could it be when your job was to stand next to fake tanks, hoping real enemy gunners wouldn't notice they were inflatable? But this artistic sensibility wasn't just a sidelight to their military service. It was essential to their mission. A professional soldier might place dummy tanks in tactically sound positions, but only an artist would understand how those positions looked from above, how shadows fell, how the human eye perceived depth and authenticity. A radio operator could follow procedure, but a theater-trained actor understood how to make scripted dialogue sound spontaneous and natural. The Ghost Army succeeded because they thought like artists staging an elaborate performance for the deadliest audience imaginable. By March 1945, Allied forces were pushing deep into Germany. The Rhine River represented the last major natural barrier protecting the German heartland, and crossing it would require one of the war's most difficult military operations. The Ghost Army was tasked with pulling off their most ambitious deception yet, convincing the Germans that the U.S. Ninth Army would cross the Rhine at a location far from the actual crossing site. The operation was codenamed Viersen, and it would become the Ghost Army's masterpiece. The actual crossing was planned near Rheinberg. The Ghost Army would create a phantom buildup 30 miles south, near Viersen, to draw German reserves away from the real attack. The scale of the deception was staggering. Over 3 days, Ghost Army units would simulate 2 entire divisions, more than 30,000 men, preparing for a river assault. They'd have to create every aspect of such an operation. The engineering equipment for building bridges, the boats and amphibious vehicles for the assault crossing, the tanks and artillery for fire support, the supply dumps to sustain the operation. And they'd have to do it all within range of German artillery and observation posts on the far bank of the Rhine. The operation began on March 18th. Under cover of darkness, Ghost Army trucks brought in hundreds of inflatable tanks, artillery pieces, and fake supply dumps. But Viersen required more than visual deception. The Germans had to hear and feel this phantom army. The sonic deception unit deployed closer to German lines than ever before, hiding their speaker-equipped half-tracks in buildings and treelines. The recordings they played weren't just tank engines. They created a complete audio environment. The sound of bridge-building equipment, the hammering and sawing of engineers constructing boat ramps, the diesel rumble of amphibious vehicles being tested, the metallic clanking of pontoon sections being assembled. Radio operators transmitted hundreds of messages using the call signs of engineering battalions, assault boat companies, and amphibious vehicle units. They discussed tide tables, current speeds, and river conditions. They requested specific equipment for river crossings: assault boats, life preservers, bridge components. Specialized flash units simulated the muzzle flashes of artillery batteries conducting ranging fire, testing their guns before an assault. These flash effects, created using carefully timed explosive charges and spotlights, would appear on German observation posts' records as evidence of artillery preparation. Meanwhile, the real buildup was happening 30 miles north, camouflaged and conducted in radio silence. The deception worked beyond anyone's expectations. German commanders diverted significant reserves to defend against the phantom Viersen crossing. When the real assault came at Rheinberg, defenders were undermanned and surprised. The Ninth Army established its bridgehead with far lighter casualties than anticipated. The Ghost Army had potentially saved hundreds, maybe thousands of American lives, but they paid a price. Operating so close to enemy lines, several Ghost Army soldiers were killed by German artillery fire. They died manning fake radio posts and guarding inflatable tanks, theatrical props in history's deadliest drama. What made the Ghost Army effective wasn't just their technical skill at creating fake equipment. It was their deep understanding of how people perceive reality and how those perceptions could be manipulated. The Ghost Army's officers studied German intelligence procedures obsessively. They learned what evidence German analysts considered most reliable, what they tended to overlook, and what cognitive biases they fell prey to. They discovered that German intelligence heavily weighted certain types of evidence. Radio intercepts were considered extremely reliable. The Germans believed, reasonably, that armies couldn't fake radio communications convincingly. So the Ghost Army invested enormous effort in radio deception, creating entire fictitious communication networks that mimicked real units down to the smallest details. Aerial reconnaissance photos were also given great credibility. But the Ghost Army learned that photo interpreters looked for specific markers of authenticity: track marks, defensive positioning, tactical logic, and evidence of human activity. So every fake installation was staged to provide exactly those markers. Interestingly, the Ghost Army discovered that perfection was actually suspicious. Real military units are messy, disorganized, and make mistakes. So the Ghost Army deliberately introduced errors and inconsistencies into their deceptions. They'd position one tank slightly wrong. They'd have a radio operator make a procedural mistake. They'd leave gaps in camouflage netting. These mistakes actually made the deceptions more convincing because they felt authentically military. The sonic deception exploited a different psychological vulnerability: the human brain's tendency to create coherent narratives from fragmentary evidence. When German listeners heard tank engines in the distance, and their reconnaissance confirmed visual evidence of tanks in that location, and their radio intelligence detected armored units communicating from that area, their brains naturally wove these separate threads into a single, coherent conclusion: an armored division was present. The Ghost Army understood that people don't perceive reality directly. They construct it from clues and evidence. And if you could control those clues carefully enough, you could make people perceive whatever reality you wanted them to see. This psychological sophistication set the Ghost Army apart from earlier military deceptions, which tended to be simpler and more straightforward. The Ghost Army didn't just put fake tanks in a field and hope the enemy noticed. They created elaborate, multi-layered illusions that addressed how intelligence analysts actually processed information. In many ways, the Ghost Army was practicing what would later be called information warfare, shaping the enemy's perception of reality as a weapon in itself. For all their successes, the Ghost Army operated on a knife's edge between brilliant deception and catastrophic exposure. Several operations nearly ended in disaster. During one mission in Luxembourg, a sudden windstorm struck while the Ghost Army had deployed dozens of inflatable tanks. The wind tore several loose from their moorings, sending them tumbling across fields like enormous beach balls. In full view of a German observation post less than a mile away, Ghost Army soldiers sprinted after the bouncing rubber tanks, desperately trying to secure them before German observers realized what they were seeing. For 15 terrifying minutes, they chased inflatable Sherman tanks across the Luxembourg countryside, expecting German artillery to open fire at any moment. Miraculously, the Germans didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they apparently couldn't believe what they were seeing and dismissed it as impossible. On another occasion, near the German border, a Ghost Army unit was setting up fake artillery when actual German infantry patrols stumbled onto their position. The Ghost Army soldiers, mostly artists and designers, not combat troops, found themselves in a genuine firefight with enemy infantry. Armed with their standard M1 carbines and with no combat training beyond basic marksmanship, they had to defend their position while frantically deflating and packing up their fake equipment. Several soldiers were wounded before American combat units arrived to drive off the Germans. The incident highlighted the Ghost Army's strange position in the war. They were performing elaborate theatrical deceptions while operating in active combat zones. They couldn't defend themselves like real combat units because they were often deployed in small, isolated groups. Yet they had to maintain their deceptions within range of enemy weapons. Perhaps the closest call came during the Rhine crossing deception. A Ghost Army soldier, operating a sonic playback unit near German lines, accidentally left the volume too high when starting a recording of bridge-building sounds. The sudden, impossibly loud crash of construction noise echoing across the river was so obviously artificial that it should have exposed the entire operation. The soldier frantically adjusted the volume, his hands shaking, certain he'd just doomed the mission and probably gotten himself killed. He waited for German artillery to start ranging in on his position, revealing that they'd seen through the deception. But nothing happened. Whether the Germans didn't notice or attributed the strange sound to some acoustic quirk of the river valley, or simply couldn't believe the Allies would try something so audacious, they didn't react. The deception held, and the actual crossing succeeded. These close calls were reminders that the Ghost Army was engaged in an extraordinarily dangerous form of warfare. They weren't just risking death in combat, they were risking it while essentially unarmed, standing next to rubber balloons shaped like tanks, hoping the enemy wouldn't look too closely. The Ghost Army story is often told as a tale of creative genius and clever trickery, which it was. But it's important to remember that these were real soldiers in a real war, and they paid a real price. While the Ghost Army's casualty rate was lower than that of frontline infantry units, they did suffer losses. Men were killed by German artillery fire while manning fake positions. Others were wounded in the few direct combat encounters they experienced. Some died in vehicle accidents while moving equipment under blackout conditions. But perhaps more significant was the psychological toll. Imagine being a 22-year-old art student from Manhattan, standing in a French field at midnight, inflating a rubber tank while you could hear German artillery pounding positions a few miles away. Knowing that if the Germans spotted you, you'd be defenseless. Knowing that your safety depended entirely on the Germans believing your illusion. The stress of this work was immense and constant. Unlike infantry soldiers who endured intense combat but also had periods of relative safety behind the lines, the Ghost Army soldiers were always on stage. Every mission required them to maintain their deceptions for days or weeks at a time, never knowing if the Germans had seen through the trick and were simply waiting for the right moment to strike. Some Ghost Army veterans later spoke about the surreal cognitive dissonance of their service. They'd spend the morning inflating fake tanks and positioning dummy artillery, then the afternoon sketching pastoral French landscapes, then the evening in a captured German village drinking with soldiers from real combat units who just fought their way through brutal battles. They felt disconnected from both the civilian world they'd left and the combat soldiers they served alongside. The civilians couldn't understand the war. The combat soldiers couldn't understand what the Ghost Army did, and the Ghost Army couldn't tell them because their work was classified. After the war, many Ghost Army veterans struggled to explain their service. When they told people they'd been in a unit that created fake armies, people often thought they were joking or exaggerating. The Ghost Army's work remained classified for decades, so these veterans couldn't even prove their stories were true. This secrecy added another layer of psychological burden. They'd participated in one of the most creative and successful military operations of the war, potentially saving thousands of lives. But they couldn't talk about it, couldn't receive recognition for it, couldn't process their experiences by sharing them with others. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s, when the Ghost Army's records were declassified, that these veterans could finally tell their full story. By then, many had passed away, taking their experiences with them. The Ghost Army was disbanded shortly after VE Day in 1945. Their equipment was destroyed or warehoused. Their soldiers returned to civilian life, mostly resuming the artistic careers they'd interrupted to serve. And for 40 years, almost nobody knew what they'd accomplished. When the Ghost Army story finally emerged in the 1980s, it captivated military historians and the public alike. Here was a chapter of World War II that seemed to come from a spy novel rather than historical record. An army of artists and designers using creativity as a weapon. The Ghost Army staged more than 20 major deceptions across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. According to post-war analysis, their operations likely drew German forces away from actual Allied attacks at least a dozen times. While it's impossible to calculate exactly how many lives they saved, military historians estimate it was in the thousands. But the Ghost Army's legacy extends beyond World War II. Their operations helped establish deception as a legitimate and powerful tool of modern warfare. During the Cold War, both American and Soviet forces studied the Ghost Army's techniques. The principles they pioneered, multi-layered deceptions addressing different intelligence collection methods, psychological manipulation of enemy perception, the importance of tactical logic in making deceptions believable, became standard doctrine. The 1991 Gulf War saw extensive use of deception operations inspired by the Ghost Army. Coalition forces used fake radio networks, dummy equipment, and sonic deception to convince Iraqi commanders that the main attack would come from a different direction than it actually did. More recently, Ghost Army techniques have evolved into sophisticated information warfare and cyber deception operations. The core insight that you can manipulate enemy decision-making by shaping their perception of reality remains central to modern military strategy. Perhaps most importantly, the Ghost Army demonstrated that warfare requires more than firepower and logistics. It requires imagination, creativity, and the ability to see beyond conventional military thinking. Many of the Ghost Army veterans went on to distinguished careers in art and design, bringing the lessons of their wartime service into the creative world. Bill Blass built a fashion empire. Ellsworth Kelly became one of America's most celebrated abstract artists. Art Kane revolutionized fashion photography. These men had learned during the war that reality is, to some extent, performative, that with sufficient skill and conviction, you can make people see what you want them to see. That lesson, learned while inflating rubber tanks under German artillery fire, influenced American art, design, and visual culture for decades. While the Ghost Army's operations were extraordinary, understanding who these men were makes their story even more remarkable. Take Arthur Shilstone, one of the unit's most talented artists. Before the war, he'd studied at the Art Students League in New York, dreaming of becoming an illustrator. In the Ghost Army, he found himself painting fake unit insignia on inflatable tanks and teaching other soldiers how to create convincing camouflage. But Shilstone never stopped being an artist. Between operations, he painted portraits of his fellow soldiers, capturing not just their physical features but their psychological state. The strange combination of fear, boredom, excitement, and absurdity that defined Ghost Army service. One of his most powerful paintings shows a Ghost Army soldier standing guard next to a line of inflatable tanks at dusk. The soldier's posture suggests exhaustion and vigilance in equal measure. The rubber tanks, partially deflated and sagging, look oddly tragic, like props from a play that's run too long. Shilstone survived the war and went on to become a successful illustrator, but he said his Ghost Army experience taught him something crucial about his art. That images have power not because they represent reality, but because they shape how people perceive reality. Or consider Ned Harris, a radio operator from Texas who joined the Ghost Army after working at a radio station in Houston. Harris was responsible for impersonating real units over military radio networks, essentially playing a character on the air for an audience of German intelligence officers. He approached this work with the seriousness of a method actor. He studied the real units he was impersonating, learning their officers' names, their communication patterns, even the regional accents of their radio operators. He created backstories for fictional soldiers he referenced in his transmissions. He maintained detailed notes on every fake unit he portrayed, ensuring consistency across multiple operations. Harris later said that during operations, he'd sometimes forget he was pretending. He'd become so immersed in his character, a radio operator for a fictional armored division, that the unit felt real to him. Only when the operation ended and the fake tanks were deflated would reality reassert itself. This total commitment to the illusion was typical of Ghost Army soldiers. They understood, perhaps instinctively, that the deception would only work if they believed in it themselves. The Ghost Army's success depended on specialized equipment that was itself a marvel of wartime engineering and design. The inflatable tanks and artillery pieces were manufactured by a rubber company in the Northeast United States. Creating them required solving numerous technical challenges. The rubber had to be tough enough to resist punctures from branches and debris, but light enough that four soldiers could carry a tank. The fabric had to hold air under various temperature conditions. The colors and textures had to photograph realistically from aircraft at 10,000 feet. Engineers tested dozens of prototypes, learning through trial and error. Early versions deflated too quickly or photographed obviously as fakes. Others were too heavy or too fragile. The final designs represented a sophisticated understanding of materials science, optics, and manufacturing. Each inflatable tank came with a portable air compressor and could be inflated in about 15 minutes by a four-man crew. Properly positioned and camouflaged, they could fool aerial reconnaissance completely. From the ground, at even a few hundred yards, they looked convincing if you didn't examine them too closely. The sonic deception equipment was even more sophisticated. engineers had gone to actual military bases and recorded genuine tank formations, artillery batteries, and engineer units at work. They used state-of-the-art recording equipment, the 1940s equivalent of high-fidelity audio. These recordings were then pressed onto large transcription discs or recorded on magnetic wire, a precursor to magnetic tape. The playback equipment, mounted on modified half-tracks, could project these sounds across several miles using directional speakers. The Ghost Army sound engineers learned to orchestrate these recordings like a musical composition. They'd layer multiple recordings, tank engine starting, then revving, then moving out, to create the impression of a unit going through standard procedures. They'd add sounds of shouted commands, vehicle horns, the grinding of gears. They even learned to account for acoustic conditions. Sound travels differently across open fields, through forests, over water, in fog or rain. The sonic deception crews had to adjust volume, timing, and positioning based on weather conditions and terrain to make their audio illusions convincing. The radio equipment was relatively standard. The Ghost Army used the same radios as regular units, but they employed them in specialized ways, creating entire fake communication networks. They'd have multiple operators, each playing a different role in a fictional unit, communicating with each other using proper procedure and terminology. This required extraordinary coordination. Imagine staging a radio play where the audience is enemy intelligence officers trying to detect inconsistencies, and the stakes are hundreds of lives. Despite decades of research and the declassification of Ghost Army records, some aspects of their operations remain mysterious or disputed. One persistent question: did German intelligence ever actually realize they were facing fake units? German records from the war are incomplete. Many were destroyed in the final chaotic months. But what survives doesn't contain any clear indication that German commanders understood the scope of Allied deception operations. Some historians argue that German intelligence must have suspected something, even if they didn't grasp the full picture. Others contend that the Germans were completely fooled, repeatedly directing reserves to counter phantom threats. The truth is probably somewhere in between. German intelligence officers likely noticed anomalies and inconsistencies in the evidence they collected. But in the fog of war, with incomplete information and constant pressure to make decisions quickly, they may have dismissed their doubts or attributed strange observations to other causes. There's also the question of how much the Ghost Army's deceptions actually influenced German decision-making versus simply confirming what German commanders already believed. The Rhine crossing deception, for instance, worked partly because German generals expected the Allies to cross at Viersen anyway. The Ghost Army didn't create this expectation, they reinforced it. Parsing out the Ghost Army's exact contribution to Allied victories is therefore difficult. Military historians generally agree they were effective, but quantifying that effectiveness precisely is nearly impossible. Another mystery involves the Ghost Army's operations in the war's final months. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, the Ghost Army continued staging deceptions, but records from this period are sparse. Some veterans hinted at operations that remained classified even after the general declassification in the 1990s, but no official records of these missions have emerged. There are also unanswered questions about whether similar deception units operated in other theaters of World War II. The Ghost Army was the most sophisticated deception unit in the European theater, but did similar units exist in the Pacific? In North Africa, some evidence suggests smaller-scale deception operations occurred elsewhere, but nothing approaching the Ghost Army's scope. In the end, the Ghost Army story reveals something profound about the nature of modern warfare. We tend to think of war as purely about firepower, logistics, and manpower, but the Ghost Army demonstrated that perception, imagination, and creativity can be equally powerful weapons. They showed that sometimes the best way to win a battle is to make the enemy think they're fighting a battle somewhere else entirely. Their success depended on understanding that war is fought not just in physical space, but in the minds of commanders making decisions based on imperfect information. Control what information they receive, and you control their decisions. Control their decisions, and you control the battle's outcome without firing a shot. This makes the Ghost Army's story remarkably relevant today, in an era when information warfare, cyber operations, and perception management have become central to military strategy. The Ghost Army pioneered techniques that are now standard, creating false narratives, manipulating sensor data, shaping enemy perception through coordinated multi-domain operations. But what makes their story truly special is that they did all this while remaining, fundamentally, artists and creative people. They brought artistic sensibility to warfare, not glorifying violence or conflict, but finding ways to end it with less bloodshed. The Ghost Army saved lives through creativity. They turned art and design into tools for survival. They proved that sometimes the pen or the paintbrush or the theatrical prop really is mightier than the sword. Their legacy lives on not just in military doctrine, but in a broader understanding of how perception shapes reality. The Ghost Army showed us that reality, at least as we experience it through intelligence and information, is to some extent a construction, and that with sufficient skill, that construction can be manipulated. For the men who served in the Ghost Army, their wartime service was both the most terrifying and most creative period of their lives. They were artists forced to become warriors, and they found a way to be both simultaneously. After the war, many of them went on to distinguished careers, their work enriched by their understanding that reality is performative, that perception can be shaped, and that creativity can be a form of courage. Bill Blass would dress first ladies and movie stars, but he never forgot standing in a muddy French field inflating rubber tanks while German artillery rumbled in the distance. Ellsworth Kelly's abstract masterpieces hung in the world's great museums, but they were created by a mind that had learned to see pattern and deception everywhere. Art Kane's photographs captured the glamour and style of mid-century America, but he'd learned his craft documenting a war where nothing was as it seemed. The Ghost Army was disbanded in 1945. Their equipment was destroyed or mothballed. Their records were classified and locked away for 40 years. But their legacy endures, in military doctrine, in art and design, and in the ongoing understanding that the most powerful weapons aren't always the ones that explode. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is a story, carefully crafted, brilliantly told, and utterly convincing even when it's completely untrue. The Ghost Army proved that in war, as in art, the most important battles are often fought not over territory but over perception. And sometimes the bravest soldiers are the ones armed not with rifles, but with imagination.